For 7 years, I quietly paid my son's mortgage, believing that's what unconditional love looked like. I never asked for thanks, never kept score, and never imagined it would come back to haunt me. Then I found out I was uninvited from his wedding. No explanation, no conversation. I didn't fight it. I didn't beg. I just stopped paying, and that's when the real story began. The mortgage payments began during a moment that felt temporary, almost harmless. My son was overwhelmed, newly responsible for a home that stretched beyond his financial comfort. There was stress in his voice, uncertainty in his plans, and that familiar parental instinct in me that said this was the moment to step in. I told myself it would only be for a short while, just until things stabilized. I wasn't rescuing him, I reasoned. I was supporting him, the way parents are supposed to when their children stumble. At first, each payment felt purposeful. It carried a sense of pride, even relief. I imagined the weight lifting from his shoulders each month, imagined him sleeping better at night because he knew the roof over his head was secure. I didn't announce what I was doing to anyone. I didn't expect praise or recognition. In my mind, this was private love, the purest kind. Something between a parent and a child that didn't need words. But temporary help has a way of quietly turning permanent when no one questions it. Months passed, then years, and the payments never stopped. What changed was how they felt. What once felt like a choice slowly became a responsibility I carried alone. The transfer went out automatically, month after month, as predictable as the calendar. I noticed how rarely it crossed my son's mind anymore. It had become part of the background of his life, as unremarkable as electricity or running water. As his life expanded, mine slowly contracted. He upgraded his furniture, traveled more, talked about plans that assumed stability. Meanwhile, I adjusted my own expectations. I delayed things I had once looked forward to. Retirement plans became vague ideas instead of timelines. I told myself comfort could wait, that there was dignity in sacrifice. After all, wasn't this what good parents did? Didn't love mean choosing your child's security over your own ease? I never demanded gratitude. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't why I helped. But respect felt like a reasonable expectation. Acknowledgement, even in small ways, mattered more than words of thanks. Over time, though, even that faded. Conversations shifted. Financial support was no longer something we circled around carefully. It was assumed, baked into the structure of his life. There was no check-in, no awareness of what it cost me to keep saying yes. I began to notice the imbalance, not through arguments, but through absence. There were fewer calls just to ask how I was doing. Fewer moments where my presence felt necessary beyond what I provided. When decisions were made, they no longer included me. I told myself not to read into it, that adulthood naturally creates distance. Still, a quiet discomfort settled in, the kind you ignore because facing it would mean admitting something painful. The illusion I held onto was that this financial support was building something permanent between us. I believed shared sacrifice created unbreakable bonds, that one day, when circumstances changed, there would be understanding, maybe even appreciation for the years I held everything together behind the scenes. That belief kept me going more than duty ever could. It gave meaning to the strain, to the tightening budget, to the small personal losses I brushed aside. Yet the warning signs were there, subtle but persistent. Assumptions replaced conversations. Expectations replaced requests. Silence replaced gratitude. I noticed how easily my support could be overlooked, how naturally it was accepted without reflection. There was no malice in it, just a quiet entitlement that grew stronger the longer I stayed silent. I didn't confront it because I didn't want to disrupt the peace, didn't want to be seen as controlling or resentful, so I kept paying. I kept believing. I told myself love didn't need to be seen to be real. But somewhere along the way, the payments stopped feeling like an expression of love and started feeling like proof of my invisibility. The more I gave, the less present I seemed to become in his world. My role narrowed, reduced to a function rather than a relationship. I thought the payments were invisible acts of love, until I realized they had made me invisible too. The moment help becomes expected, love stops being love and starts becoming leverage. I didn't recognize that shift right away because it didn't arrive loudly. There was no argument, no demand, no moment where my son explicitly said he relied on me. It happened slowly, through silence. The payments kept going out, but the acknowledgement stopped coming back. What was once discussed with care became something neither of us mentioned at all, as if speaking about it might break the illusion that everything was normal. I noticed the change in small, unsettling ways. Conversations that once carried warmth now felt transactional, focused on his life, his plans, his progress. My role in those conversations shrank. The mortgage payment, which had once been a shared understanding, became invisible. It was no longer something he seemed aware of, let alone grateful for. The absence of acknowledgement wasn't cruel, but it was revealing. It told me that what I gave had been absorbed into expectation. As his lifestyle improved, the contrast between our worlds became harder to ignore. He spoke casually about upgrades, trips, and future plans that assumed stability and freedom. Meanwhile, I became more careful. I postponed decisions, trimmed expenses, and quietly accepted limitations I never imagined I would have at this stage of my life. I didn't resent him for living well, but I couldn't ignore that his comfort was partially built on my restraint. That imbalance settled heavily in my chest, even when I tried to dismiss it. What hurt more than the financial strain was the lack of emotional reciprocity. Support had flowed in one direction for so long that I barely noticed when it stopped flowing back. There were fewer moments of genuine concern about my well-being, fewer pauses to ask how I was managing or whether I needed anything. I told myself this was normal, that parents give and children grow. Still, something about the emptiness lingered, an unspoken realization that the relationship had quietly tilted. There were moments when I could have set boundaries. I see them clearly now. Times when a simple conversation might have reset expectations or restored balance. But each time, I hesitated. I worried about being misunderstood. I feared that bringing up money would make me seem controlling or petty, as if love had conditions. I didn't want to risk being labeled selfish after years of giving freely, so I stayed silent, convincing myself that endurance was the more loving choice. Guilt became my strongest motivator, stronger even than love. I felt guilty imagining what might happen if I stopped. Guilty at the thought of causing stress or instability. Guilty for even considering my own needs when his life felt so much larger and more urgent. That guilt blurred my judgment, keeping me locked into a cycle I no longer felt good about but didn't know how to escape. It was easier to keep paying than to face the discomfort of change. There were subtle shifts in how my son spoke to me, changes I initially brushed aside. He didn't ask for help anymore. He assumed it. Decisions were made with the expectation that the foundation beneath him was secure. I wasn't consulted, just informed, if that. It wasn't intentional cruelty, but it carried a quiet message. My contribution was no longer seen as a gift but as a given. That realization stung more than any argument ever could have. Inside, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to speak up, to reclaim some sense of balance. Another part feared that doing so would fracture what little connection remained. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was being unreasonable, if my discomfort was just a natural part of aging, of letting go. The thought of being perceived as a burden or an obstacle weighed heavily on me, pushing me back into silence. Over time, I began to sense a shift in power that I hadn't noticed before. The money I provided no longer felt like support. It felt like a tether. It kept me in place, careful and compliant. I avoided difficult conversations, not because I lacked courage, but because I feared losing what little access I still had to my son's life. The irony was painful. The very thing meant to help him stand on his own had quietly taken away my voice. I didn't know it yet, but the money wasn't just paying for a house. It was buying my silence. Nothing prepares you for the moment you realize your child's happiest day no longer has room for you. I had always imagined a wedding as more than a ceremony. In my mind, it was a milestone that stitched the past to the future, a moment that acknowledged where a family came from and where it was going. Even after years of quiet distance, I believed I would be included in that kind of moment. Not because I demanded a place of honor, but because I assumed a parent's presence was natural, almost unquestioned. When I first learned he was getting married, Something warm opened up inside me. Pride, of course, but also relief. It felt like proof that despite everything, despite the long months, the financial pressure, the awkward silences, he was building a life. I tried to be careful with my excitement, the way I had learned to be careful with everything. Still, I allowed myself to picture it, the setting, the guests, the moment he stepped into a new chapter. I told myself I didn't need to be central to it. I just needed to be there. I invested emotionally in ways I didn't even realize at the time. I paid attention to details when he mentioned them, tucked away little bits of information like they were precious. I tried to make myself available without hovering, supportive without being intrusive. In quiet moments, I imagined what it would feel like to sit among other families, to witness his happiness, to feel that small reassurance that I still mattered to him in a way that wasn't tied to money. After 7 years of supporting his stability, I believed I had earned at least a seat in the room. That expectation wasn't rooted in entitlement. It was rooted in history. In the years I had carried the mortgage like a second heartbeat, I had also carried the belief that this was what family meant. Showing up, staying connected, being counted. I never asked him to repay me. I never said the support came with strings. But I assumed, quietly, that being his parent still meant something. That assumption felt so obvious to me that I didn't even think to protect it. As the wedding got closer, the tone around it shifted. Not in a way that made sense, not in a way that gave me time to prepare. Information came less frequently. Updates felt filtered, vague. I told myself it was stress, that weddings made people scattered. I kept my pride in check and didn't push. I didn't want to be the parent who added pressure, who made it about themselves. So I waited, believing that eventually the invitation would come in the natural way such things always did. Then it happened, abruptly, like a door shutting in the middle of a sentence. The uninvitation wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was cold, final, and strangely casual, as if it was an adjustment to a schedule, not a decision that would carve into someone's life. There was no explanation that felt real. No conversation that acknowledged the weight of what was being done. Just the fact of it, delivered in a way that made it clear I wasn't meant to argue. For a moment, my mind refused to accept it. I replayed what I'd heard, as if the meaning might change if I examined it from a different angle. I tried to find logic in it, some detail I'd missed, some misunderstanding that could be corrected with a calm response. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't confusion. This was choice. He had chosen a wedding without me, and he had chosen to make that choice feel normal. Humiliation crept in slowly, then all at once. It wasn't just the loss of the event, it was the message underneath it. I could handle being overlooked in daily life. I had trained myself to accept that, but a wedding is public. It becomes a story people tell. It becomes photos, seating charts, whispers, and assumptions. People would notice I wasn't there. People would ask. And the most humiliating part was that I would have no explanation that protected my dignity. I would be absent, and the absence would speak louder than I ever could. I felt confusion that turned into disbelief. After years of sacrifice, after years of quietly supporting the foundation of his life, how could I be so easily excluded? I wasn't asking for gratitude. I wasn't asking for repayment. I was asking, without even speaking it aloud, for basic belonging. That question echoed in my mind. What was I, then, if not someone worth inviting? What did those 7 years mean if they couldn't even buy me the simplest courtesy of inclusion? And still, I didn't explode. I didn't beg. I didn't threaten. My reaction surprised even me. I sat with it in a kind of quiet shock, the kind that makes your body feel heavy and numb at the same time. I understood, in that moment, that any dramatic response would only give him a reason to justify what he had done. I refused to hand him that. So I stayed composed on the outside, even as something inside me cracked. It was the public nature of it that haunted me most. This wasn't a private disagreement or a temporary distance. This was a line drawn in front of the world. And in that line, I saw my position clearly. Not essential, not valued, not even considered. I was no longer part of the story he wanted to present. Whatever role I once held had been reduced, minimized, and quietly erased. I didn't cry that day, but something in me shut down permanently. Sometimes the loudest betrayal comes not from words, but from the silence that follows them. After the uninvitation, I didn't fall apart in any dramatic way. There was no scene, no frantic calls, no desperate attempts to force my way back into a day I had been told I didn't belong in. What came instead was a quiet, hollow stretch of time where everything in my life looked the same on the outside, but felt permanently altered underneath. I moved through my days like a person who had misplaced something important and couldn't figure out where it went. The first few days were the strangest. I kept expecting the uninvitation to be corrected, not because I thought my son would suddenly become considerate, but because the decision felt so irrational that my mind refused to treat it as final. I waited for a follow-up message, an explanation, any sign that he understood what he had done. None came. What did arrive were ordinary updates about his life, shared casually, as if nothing had happened. That was the part that truly unsettled me, the ease with which he moved forward. He carried on as normal, plans continued. His world stayed bright and busy, full of small problems and casual priorities. Meanwhile, my world narrowed into one repeating thought. How could someone cut you out and then behave as if you were still fine? There was no apology, no recognition, no accountability, just a smooth continuation, like my absence had already been practiced and rehearsed long before it was announced. I started to realize the uninvitation wasn't just a decision about a wedding, it was a signal about the entire relationship. The silence between us wasn't the kind that comes from anger. It wasn't even the tense silence of a conflict waiting to be resolved. It was worse than that. It was the silence of someone who didn't feel there was anything to resolve. My son didn't seem worried that he'd hurt me. He didn't seem curious about my reaction. He didn't seem afraid of consequences. That told me he had already decided what my emotions were worth, and the answer was, not much. I felt loneliness in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being dismissed. I realized, with a cold clarity, that support doesn't automatically create belonging. I had paid for stability, not connection. I had funded comfort, not loyalty, and I had done it so quietly that it was easy for him to pretend it wasn't happening at all. The more I sat with that thought, the heavier it became. In the quiet moments, making coffee, sorting mail, folding laundry, I found myself replaying every sacrifice like a film I couldn't turn off. I remembered the first payment, how it felt like doing the right thing. I remembered the months when I told myself it would end soon. I remembered the years when I adjusted my own life around his needs. I pictured all the things I didn't do, the trips I postponed, the repairs I delayed, the savings I chipped away at. None of it felt heroic anymore. It felt naive. There was a particular kind of pain in realizing that I had never been asked to do this for 7 years. I had volunteered. I had insisted it was fine. I had reassured him repeatedly, without demanding anything in return. Part of me wanted to blame him entirely, but another part of me saw my own role in it. I had taught him what to expect by never challenging the expectation. I had made generosity so consistent that it no longer looked like generosity. It looked like the natural order of things. That realization led to the first internal shift toward self-respect. It didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as exhaustion. A tired, steady awareness that something was deeply wrong and that pretending otherwise was costing me more than money. I began to feel a quiet rebellion inside me, not the kind that looks for revenge, but the kind that seeks dignity. I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong and started asking what I had allowed. The longer the silence continued, the more I recognized that love, in this relationship, had never been mutual. I had mistaken my giving for closeness. I had assumed sacrifice would be honored simply because it was sincere. But sincerity doesn't guarantee respect. I could love him without limits, and he could still treat me as optional. That truth settled in like a stone. It didn't make me hate him. It made me see him clearly. And once I saw him clearly, one question began to rise above all others. It started quietly, like a thought I didn't want to entertain, then grew louder with each passing day. Why am I still paying? I tried to push it away at first. I told myself it was petty to connect money to emotional pain. I told myself stopping would make me the villain. But the question didn't disappear because it wasn't about punishment. It was about reality. It was about whether I could keep funding someone who had made it clear I didn't matter. For the first time in 7 years, I opened my bank account, not with pride, but with clarity. There is a moment when endurance stops being strength and starts being self-betrayal. I didn't recognize it immediately because I had spent years confusing patience with virtue. I told myself that holding on was proof of love, that letting go would mean failure. But after the wedding uninvitation and the silence that followed, that belief began to feel hollow. What I was enduring no longer felt noble. It felt like I was slowly erasing myself to preserve a peace that didn't truly exist. The internal battle was relentless. Guilt spoke first and loudest. It reminded me that I was a parent, that parents don't abandon their children when things get uncomfortable. It whispered that stopping support would make me cruel, that it would confirm every unspoken fear I had about being seen as controlling or resentful. Guilt framed the situation as a test of loyalty, and for a long time it had always won. But this time, dignity began to push back. Dignity asked quieter questions, the kind that lingered long after guilt finished shouting. It asked why my needs had become irrelevant. It asked why love required me to remain silent while being dismissed. It asked why I was still afraid to upset someone who had already shown me how little my feelings mattered. Those questions didn't demand immediate answers, but they refused to be ignored. The idea of stopping the payments terrified me, not because I feared the financial change, but because of what it symbolized. The mortgage had become more than money. It was my last visible connection to my son's daily life. As long as I paid it, I could pretend I was still necessary. Cutting that support felt like stepping into an unknown space where I no longer had a role, no longer had leverage, no longer had an excuse to stay silent. The fear wasn't about losing him. It was about facing the truth of where I already stood. The one line I eventually recognized wasn't something I announced or dramatized. It wasn't drawn out of anger or designed to punish. It was symbolic, internal, and deeply personal. That line was the boundary between supporting someone and disappearing for them, between generosity and self-neglect. I realized that continuing to pay wasn't an act of love anymore. It was an act of avoidance. I was avoiding confrontation, avoiding grief, avoiding the reality that the relationship had changed, whether I accepted it or not. I made a conscious decision not to threaten or explain myself in advance. There were no ultimatums, no warnings meant to provoke guilt or force gratitude. I didn't want compliance. I wanted clarity. I understood that if my support only existed because I feared what would happen if I stopped, then it wasn't support at all, it was submission. And I had already submitted enough. What surprised me most was how my anger faded as clarity took its place. I had expected to feel rage, resentment, maybe even satisfaction at the thought of reclaiming control. Instead, there was a steady calm. The decision didn't come from a desire to hurt anyone. It came from a need to stop hurting myself. That distinction mattered deeply to me. I wasn't reacting, I was choosing. Reclaiming control carried an unexpected emotional weight. For years, my sense of worth had been tied to what I provided. Letting go of that role felt like shedding a skin I had outgrown but still recognized as my own. There was grief in it, but also relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with myself. I wasn't betraying my values. I was finally honoring them. I thought about all the ways I had tried to earn respect through consistency, hoping that reliability would eventually translate into appreciation. I saw now that respect doesn't grow out of endless giving. It grows out of boundaries. By never drawing a line, I had taught others that there wasn't one. That realization stung, but it also empowered me. It meant I wasn't helpless. It meant I could change the pattern without changing who I was. The choice felt calm because it was rooted in acceptance. I accepted that my son might be angry. I accepted that he might see me differently. I accepted that stopping the payments could permanently alter our relationship, but I also accepted something else. Something just as important, continuing the way things were, would permanently alter my relationship with myself. And that was a cost I was no longer willing to pay. This wasn't revenge. Revenge requires bitterness. and bitterness requires obsession. What I felt was resolution. I didn't want to prove a point. I wanted peace. I wanted to wake up without the quiet resentment that had been building in me for years. I wanted my generosity, if it existed at all, to come from choice again, not fear. So I crossed the line I had avoided for 7 years. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Not with accusations or explanations that would only invite argument. I didn't announce my decision. I just quietly stopped. The absence of money revealed truths that years of generosity had hidden. I had expected the first month without my payment to feel dramatic on my side, like a personal revolution or a sharp break in routine. Instead, it felt almost unnervingly quiet. No fireworks, no immediate consequences in my home. Just a stillness where an automatic transfer used to live, and a strange sense that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't yet see. From my son's side, though, I could almost picture how it unfolded without anyone needing to spell it out. At first, nothing seemed different. His days likely moved with the usual rhythm: work, errands, wedding details, whatever filled his attention. The house still stood. The lights still turned on. The comfort of routine can make a person believe the foundation beneath them is permanent, even when it's borrowed. If he noticed anything at all early on, it might have been as a mild inconvenience, the kind you assume will resolve itself. Then the missed payment stopped being invisible. Somewhere in that month, there was a moment when he had to look at a number and realize it didn't match what he expected. A notification, a statement, a reminder, something that forced reality into view. And with that came a sudden awareness that what he considered normal had been subsidized for years, not as a favor, not as an occasional rescue, as a monthly fact. I imagined the brief pause, the mental recalculation, the quick search for an explanation that didn't involve admitting dependence. That's the thing about long-term support. It disappears into a person's life until it's gone, and then it feels like theft. Not because anything was taken, but because expectation is a powerful illusion. I could almost feel the sequence of emotions he would go through: confusion, irritation, then a tightening concern as the reality settled in. The story he had been telling himself, the one where he was fully independent, would have started to crack. What struck me most was how quickly concern can replace indifference when comfort is threatened. For years, my presence had been optional. My feelings had been negotiable. My exclusion from his wedding had been delivered like an administrative decision. But the moment the payment didn't happen, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, what I did mattered again. Suddenly, I wasn't background noise. I was the missing piece in a budget that could no longer pretend I didn't exist. I didn't need him to say it out loud for me to sense the change. The energy around him shifted in a way I recognized immediately. There was an urgency that hadn't been there before, a subtle pressure that implied a problem needed solving. It was almost comical in its predictability, and that irony carried a bitter sting. My emotional pain had been easy to ignore. A financial gap wasn't. That contrast did more to clarify the truth than any confrontation ever could have. On my side, I stayed still. Not because I was playing a game, but because I had learned that rushing to explain myself would only pull me back into the same pattern. If I reached out first, I would be offering comfort before accountability, support before respect. I had spent 7 years smoothing over discomfort for him. I wasn't doing that anymore. So I observed quietly, the way a person watches a storm they no longer intend to chase. There was a strange calm in that observation. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't hoping for him to suffer. I was simply witnessing the natural result of a dependency that had been denied for too long. And as I watched, I felt the power shift settle into place, not as a weapon, but as balance returning. For years, the relationship had been tilted by my constant giving. Now, with one silent absence, the tilt reversed. The attention that followed felt different from real care. It had a sharpness to it, a focus that wasn't about me, but about what I provided. That distinction mattered. I could feel the familiar pull to soften, to reassure, to fix it quickly so everyone could return to comfort. But comfort had been purchased at my expense for too long. If he wanted the stability I had been funding, he would have to recognize the person behind it. I began to see how my silence unsettled him. When a person is used to you absorbing discomfort, your refusal to do so becomes alarming. I didn't respond with anger or lectures. I didn't list sacrifices or demand gratitude. I simply stayed quiet, letting the situation speak. The absence of my payment was a statement more honest than anything I could say. I was no longer willing to be invisible. In that quiet, the truth became impossible to ignore. He had built a version of adulthood that relied on my sacrifice, and he had treated that sacrifice like it didn't count, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging me. The moment the payment ended, the illusion of independence collapsed into something more real and more frightening, and suddenly, the wedding drama that had once excluded me felt less important than the financial reality now pressing in on him. The same support that was once ignored was now desperately needed. I didn't seek revenge, but consequences arrived anyway. The first signs weren't dramatic, just sharp shifts in the energy around me, like the air in a room changing when someone walks in angry. For years, my support had been so consistent that it blended into the background of my son's life. The moment it stopped, it didn't just create a financial problem, it created a story problem. Suddenly, he had to explain a gap he never expected to have, and the easiest explanation wasn't the truth. It was blame. I could feel the emotional reaction coming long before it fully reached me. It moved like a wave, building momentum through assumption. There was an urgency that wasn't about our relationship, but about restoring what he considered normal. What surprised me wasn't that he reacted, but how quickly the tone shifted from indifference to outrage. It was as if my silence had been acceptable only when it benefited him. The moment my silence became a boundary, it was treated like an offense. And still, I didn't confront him. I didn't call to demand accountability for the wedding, didn't reopen wounds just to prove they existed. I stayed in my lane, calm and steady, because I understood something important. Confrontation would turn this into a debate. It would invite bargaining, excuses, and emotional gymnastics meant to pull me back into the same role. I wasn't interested in debating my right to be treated with respect. Instead, what followed felt like an attempt to rewrite the narrative around me. The person who had quietly carried the mortgage for 7 years began to be framed as cold and selfish the moment I stopped. The shift was almost dizzying. I had been reliable, dependable, good, as long as I kept giving. But the second I drew a line, I became difficult. I became the problem. The implication was clear. My value wasn't tied to who I was, but to what I funded. That reframing came with a familiar set of pressures, the kind that don't always sound like manipulation, but always feel like it. The situation was presented as an emergency. I was responsible for fixing. The unspoken message was that a good parent would never let their child feel financial strain, no matter the circumstances. It was guilt dressed up as morality, obligation disguised as love. And it pressed on every soft spot I had, every place where I had once been easy to control because I cared. I could feel the old instincts trying to rise. The urge to smooth it over. The urge to prove I wasn't selfish by stepping back in and paying again. It would have been so easy to return to the cycle. I give, he breathes easier, the tension disappears, and the relationship returns to its familiar imbalance. That's what cycles depend on, your willingness to sacrifice your peace to restore someone else's comfort. For years, I had done it without realizing the cost. This time, I saw it clearly. So I refused, calmly, without drama. Not with speeches, not with accusations, not with threats designed to win. Just refusal. That refusal wasn't loud, but it was firm. And firmness, I learned, makes people uncomfortable when they're used to your flexibility. The more I held the boundary, the more the emotional distance grew. Not because I wanted distance, but because boundaries reveal who only valued you without them. The emotional distance had a strange effect on me. I expected to feel grief and panic, maybe even regret. Instead, I felt a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The chaos that seemed to swirl on his side didn't cross into my home the way it used to. I wasn't checking my phone with dread. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head. I wasn't living in fear of being misunderstood. I had stepped out of the role of constant responder, and the stillness that followed felt like a kind of freedom. That contrast, his urgency and my calm, made the entire situation feel almost surreal. For so long, I had believed love meant absorbing discomfort so he didn't have to. Now I was watching him face discomfort that had been postponed for years, and the world hadn't ended. The house hadn't vanished. He hadn't collapsed. What he faced was simply adulthood without a hidden safety net. That wasn't cruelty. That was reality. I kept reminding myself that my decision wasn't about punishment. Punishment is reactive. This was protective. This was me choosing to stop bleeding quietly. I wasn't trying to make him suffer for uninviting me. I wasn't trying to win a moral battle. I was trying to reclaim my dignity, to make my life belong to me again. If he experienced consequences, they weren't something I inflicted with malice. They were the natural result of a dependency he had refused to acknowledge. And the more I stayed calm, the more I began to see what had been hidden under the surface of our relationship. I saw how quickly affection could turn conditional, how quickly my sacrifices could be erased and replaced with accusations, how little space there was for my feelings in a story that centered his comfort. That clarity didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way, a quiet that comes from finally understanding. For the first time, I saw clearly who I was to him and who I wasn't. The hardest grief is mourning someone who hasn't disappeared, but has emotionally erased you. I didn't lose my son in any visible way. He was still alive, still moving through the world, still building a future that looked full and promising from the outside. And yet, there was a version of him I had lost completely. A version that no longer reached back toward me, no longer recognized the bond I believed we shared. That kind of loss is difficult to explain because there is no funeral for it, no clear moment when others acknowledge that something has ended. The grief didn't arrive all at once. It came in quiet waves, triggered by ordinary things, a photo I stumbled across, a memory that surfaced unexpectedly. The sound of laughter in a public place that reminded me of earlier years when his presence felt effortless and close. I remembered a time when he looked to me not just for support, but for connection, when conversations flowed without calculation, when my role as a parent wasn't tied to what I could provide, but to who I was. Those memories didn't hurt in the sharp way they once did. They carried a softer sadness, a sense of distance that felt final rather than raw. I wasn't replaying them to blame myself or to justify my decisions anymore. I was simply acknowledging that something meaningful had existed, and that it no longer did. That acknowledgement, painful as it was, became an important step. It allowed me to stop fighting reality and start accepting it. Acceptance didn't mean approval. It didn't mean I agreed with how things unfolded or that I excused the choices that pushed me out. It meant I stopped trying to force a version of the relationship that only lived in my memory. For years, I had held on to the idea that if I gave enough, waited long enough, endured quietly enough, things would return to how they were. Letting go of that belief felt like setting down a heavy weight I didn't realize I had been carrying. There was a temptation to turn that grief into bitterness. I could feel it hovering at the edges, offering a sense of righteousness that almost felt comforting. Bitterness would have given me a clear villain and a sharper sense of identity as the wronged parent. But I knew where that path led. It would tether me to the pain instead of freeing me from it. So I chose something harder, to feel the grief without letting it harden me. In that space, something unexpected began to happen. Healing didn't look dramatic or triumphant. It looked quiet and gradual. I started noticing moments where my thoughts didn't automatically circle back to him. Hours passed where my emotional state wasn't dictated by his absence or his choices. I felt less reactive, less defined by what had been taken from me. That subtle shift marked the beginning of reclaiming myself. For so long, my identity had been deeply tied to being his parent, and more specifically, to being the parent who sacrificed without limits. I had measured my worth by my usefulness, my love by my endurance. When that role collapsed, I was forced to confront a difficult question. Who was I without it? At first, the answer felt frighteningly empty, but slowly it began to fill in with things I had neglected. I rediscovered parts of myself that had nothing to do with him, my preferences, my routines, my sense of time. I made decisions without mentally calculating how they might affect his life. That freedom felt strange at first, almost disloyal, as if choosing myself was an act of abandonment. But the more I leaned into it, the more I realized it wasn't abandonment, it was balance. Peace entered my life quietly, the way morning light fills a room without announcing itself. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from reconciliation or closure offered by another person. It came from within, from aligning my actions with my values at last. I no longer felt the constant tension of waiting for recognition or fearing rejection. The silence between us stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like space. In that space, I learned to grieve without collapsing. I learned that it was possible to love someone and still step back from the role that harmed me. I could acknowledge the loss without reopening the wound every day. That realization was powerful. It meant my emotional well-being didn't depend on his behavior anymore. It meant I had agency over my own healing. I also began to see my past sacrifices with clearer eyes. They weren't mistakes, but they weren't obligations either. They were choices I made with the best understanding I had at the time. I forgave myself for making them, and I forgave myself for stopping. Both were acts of love, directed at different people. The first was love for my son. The second was love for myself. Neither canceled the other out. There were still moments of sadness, moments when the absence felt heavy again. Grief doesn't disappear, it softens. But those moments no longer scared me. I didn't rush to fix them or explain them away. I let them pass, trusting that they didn't define my future. They were reminders of what had been, not prisons keeping me there. As I settled into this new emotional state, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Letting go didn't make me weaker. It didn't make me cold or indifferent. It made me honest. It gave me room to breathe, to grow, to exist, without constantly proving my worth through sacrifice. And in that honesty, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Letting go didn't make me weaker. It made me free. That single financial decision wasn't about money, it was about dignity. For a long time, even I had misunderstood my own story. From the outside, it could look like a conflict over finances, a disagreement that escalated because of a mortgage payment. But the deeper truth was far simpler and far more painful. Cutting that one line wasn't an act of withdrawal. It was an act of recognition. It was the moment I finally acknowledged what had been missing all along. For years, I had framed my sacrifices as love in its purest form. I believed that giving without limits was proof of commitment, that endurance itself was a virtue. But when I stepped back and looked at the full arc of what had happened, I saw something else clearly. Love had been present, yes, but respect had slowly disappeared. And without respect, love turns fragile, easily exploited, easily dismissed. The money wasn't the problem. The imbalance was. Drawing a boundary did something I hadn't expected. It restored my self-respect in a way no apology ever could have. I didn't need validation from my son to feel justified anymore. I didn't need him to agree with my decision for it to be right. The simple act of saying no, quietly, firmly reminded me that my needs were real and worthy of protection. That realization was both empowering and sobering. It showed me how long I had gone without honoring myself. As I adjusted to life without that monthly obligation, I noticed changes in myself that had nothing to do with him. I felt lighter, not because I had more money, but because I had less fear. I was no longer living with the constant anxiety of being excluded, misunderstood, or taken for granted. I wasn't monitoring my behavior to avoid upsetting someone who had already proven they didn't consider my feelings. That mental freedom was worth more than any financial contribution I had ever made. The growth that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't look like triumph. It looked like calm mornings, like decisions made without hesitation, like the absence of that familiar knot in my chest when I thought about the future. I began to trust myself again. I trusted that setting limits didn't make me cruel. I trusted that walking away from an unhealthy dynamic didn't erase the love that once existed. It simply changed how that love could be expressed. Fear had driven many of my earlier choices. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of losing my place in my son's life entirely. But as time passed, fear loosened its grip. I realized that I had already lost the version of the relationship I was clinging to long before I stopped paying the mortgage. What I gained by cutting that line wasn't distance. It was honesty. And honesty, while uncomfortable, is grounding. I didn't turn this experience into a lesson I preached to others. I wasn't interested in declaring who was right or wrong. The lessons revealed themselves quietly, through reflection rather than confrontation. I learned that generosity without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-erasure. I learned that silence can be mistaken for consent. I learned that people can accept years of sacrifice without ever truly seeing the person making it. None of those realizations made me bitter. They made me wiser. Emotional independence became my greatest reward. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to someone else. I stopped waiting for recognition that might never come. I learned to sit with my own feelings without needing them to be validated externally. That shift didn't harden me. It steadied me. It allowed me to care without compromising myself, to feel without losing control. When I looked back on the entire journey, from the first payment to the final boundary, I no longer saw it as a story of betrayal alone. I saw it as a story of awakening. I had entered it believing love meant limitless giving. I left it understanding that love also requires mutual regard. Without that balance, sacrifice becomes a transaction no one acknowledges, and the giver eventually disappears. The most important realization came slowly, settling into me over time rather than arriving in a single moment. I understood that I hadn't failed as a parent by stopping. I had failed myself by waiting so long to do it. That understanding didn't come with regret, only clarity. I had done what I thought was right with the awareness I had then. Now, I was doing what was right with the awareness I had gained. As my fear faded, peace took its place, not the fragile peace that depends on someone else's approval, but a stable one rooted in self-trust. I could look at my choices without shame. I could accept the distance without chasing reconciliation at any cost. I could hold love and boundaries in the same space without feeling conflicted. That balance changed everything. And in that clarity, one truth stood out above all others, impossible to ignore and impossible to unlearn. I finally understood that love without respect isn't love at all. I didn't lose a son. I gained myself. That truth took time to settle, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it required me to release an old definition of love I had carried for most of my life. For years, I believed closeness meant constant presence, that being involved at any cost was the only way to remain connected. Walking away from that belief felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, but once I did, the ground beneath me felt unexpectedly solid. Strength, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like silence that no longer aches. In choosing peace over proximity, I wasn't making a dramatic statement or drawing attention to my pain. I was making a private commitment to myself, one rooted in self-worth rather than sacrifice. The calm that followed wasn't hollow. It was full, steady, and earned. Closure didn't come from an apology or a reconciliation scene where everything was finally explained. It came from acceptance. I accepted that my son might never fully understand the impact of his choices, and that waiting for that understanding would only keep me tied to disappointment. Closure, I realized, isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you grant yourself when you stop asking others to complete your story. My life continued in ways that felt quieter but more honest. I filled my days with routines that belonged to me, not ones shaped around someone else's needs. I made plans without hesitation, without the underlying fear that I might be excluded or dismissed. The absence of bitterness surprised me. I had expected anger to linger, to flare up in unexpected moments. Instead, it faded as peace took root. There was no room for resentment in a life that finally felt balanced. Looking back, I could see the moral arc of the journey clearly. It wasn't about punishment or proving a point. It was about learning the difference between giving from abundance and giving from fear. I had crossed that line too many times before, believing love demanded it. Now I understood that love, to be real and sustainable, must include respect for both the giver and the receiver. The distance between my son and me remained, but it no longer defined me. I stopped measuring the health of the relationship by how close we appeared to be on the surface. Proximity without respect is just another form of loneliness. I would rather have peace at a distance than chaos in closeness. That choice didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. It allowed me to hold my memories without letting them control my present. There were moments when the old instinct tugged at me, urging me to reach out, to fix what had broken. But those moments passed more quickly now. I reminded myself that repairing something requires effort from both sides. Carrying the entire weight alone wasn't love. It was habit. Breaking that habit was one of the hardest things I had ever done, and also one of the most necessary. I didn't walk away with bitterness or triumph. I walked away with understanding. I understood my limits. I understood my worth. I understood that choosing myself didn't mean rejecting him, it meant refusing to disappear. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to feel compassion without surrendering my boundaries, to care without compromising my dignity. As time moved forward, the story stopped feeling unfinished. I no longer replayed conversations in my head or imagined different outcomes. I accepted the ending as it was, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. In that honesty, I found peace that didn't depend on circumstances or approval. It belonged to me alone. If there was one truth I carried with me from this journey, it was simple and enduring. Love should never require self-erasure. Boundaries are not walls meant to punish others. They are lines meant to protect the self. Crossing them may feel easier in the moment, but the cost reveals itself over time. I didn't lose a son in choosing peace. I gained clarity, dignity, and a life that no longer asked me to shrink. And as I moved forward, grounded in that understanding, one final thought remained with me, quiet but unwavering. Some lines, once crossed, should never be reconnected. Sometimes the strongest choice isn't to fight, but to step back with dignity. This story was never about winning or losing. It was about self-respect. When respect disappears, distance becomes the only honest response. And in choosing that distance, a life is finally reclaimed. If this story made you think of someone who's quietly giving too much, pass it along to them. It might say what they haven't been able to say out loud. Stories like this only matter when they reach the right people at the right time. And now I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the longest?